Steve Andreas, Six Blind Elephants, page 136. Scope and category script exercise. First, problem. Think of an unpleasant memory or problem, event that still bothers you when you think of it. Second, review a movie of that event with sound and feeling, from the very beginning to the end of it. Third, write a script. Now imagine that a friend is going to produce a movie of your experience of this event. You need to provide a script so that the movie your friend makes will be an accurate representation of your experience. Jot down a sentence or two for each scope and each category in your experience of this event. 4. Review script. Now go back over this script and further specify the scope of each part of it, in both space and time, how you categorize it, and what prototypes you use for each category. Which scopes are large and which small, which are momentary quick glimpses, and which seem to be longer or endless and unchanging. Which categories are more specific and which are more general. Which are appropriate and useful and which are problematic. Do you loop back to certain scopes of categories repeatedly, or previous or future time or to previous or future times in your life? What is the sequence of scopes and categories in this problem event? 5. Script revision. Now experiment with making changes in your script in order to improve it without changing the external situation. Change the sequence of scopes and categories that you use to make sense of the event. Where would a smaller, larger, or different scope in space? Where would a smaller, larger, or different scope in space and or time serve you better? How could you change the category or the prototype that you use to represent the category in order to improve it? Keep revising until you find a sequence that is more satisfying and resourceful for you. 5. Rehearsal. Now think of a time in the future when you might encounter this same kind of event again, and rehearse your new scope and category script to find out how satisfied you are with it. If you want to revise it further, back up to step 5 and then come forward again. If you rehearse it in several future contexts, it should become an automatic new response in real life when this kind of situation occurs again. Discovering how your mind works in terms of scope and category gives you the ability to alter it when your mind takes you where you don't want to go and you would like to have other choices. Thinking and language. There has been considerable debate for a long time about whether thinking is possible without language. Of course, any answer to that question depends heavily on clear and detailed specification of both the words thinking and language. Thinking is as I'm describing it, is the personal experience of a sequence of scopes in one or more of the 5 senses. How that experience is categorized and what prototype is used to represent each category, whether or not that is communicated to anyone else. Using that description, you can certainly think without using language. Language is certainly an additional skill that helps us organize and direct our thinking. But the purpose of language is to communicate our thinking to someone else. When we communicate with others, that also organizes and directs their thinking, sometimes in many ways that are useful and sometimes not. Since the primary purpose of language is to communicate the experience of one person to another, either language and thinking arose simultaneously, or thinking came first. It would be very unlikely that a means of communicating experience preceded the ability to have any experience to communicate. Since small children and animals without language can categorize and organize their experience in most of the same ways that we do, thinking must have preceded language. A variety of scientific evidence from archaeology, DNA analysis, and linguistics indicate that probably our ancestors developed some kind of language only about 70,000 years ago. 70,000 years ago. 70,000 years ago. The first beginnings of a language must have been very ambiguous, indefinite, and confusing. Even now, many of our communications are ambiguous, providing another indication that language is secondary. We often have to ask questions to clarify what someone is saying, because it is so unclear. This is particularly true when we use a lot of pronouns like he or it, or vague words like there, many, or often, etc. Some sentences or phrases can indicate two entirely different scopes, as in the following amusing newspaper headlines. Miners refuse to work after death. Red tape holds up new bridge. Kids make nutritious snacks. Language is often very ambiguous, but our experience seldom is. Even when we are uncertain about our experience, we are usually certain about our uncertainty. Since language is a relatively recent achievement, it is not surprising that we still have much to learn about how to make full use of this recently acquired skill. While language greatly helps the process of categorization, it is a later skill and not necessary to most thinking. Language can be remembered by others, which is a tremendous advantage in making knowledge last beyond a single lifetime. Written language was invented only about 10,000 years ago, permitting knowledge, both accurate and inaccurate, to accumulate much faster and be disseminated more widely across space and time. This also makes it possible for the dead to communicate what they have learned to the living, directing their attention to scopes and categories that they might otherwise never notice. This also makes it possible for the dead to communicate what they have learned to the living. Considering that Steve passed away in 2018, this is definitely his way of communicating to the living. Summary. Scope is a sensory-based experience that can be divided into smaller parts or enlarged to include it in a much larger whole. The key test for scope is: are we talking about a part of a sensory-based experience? The key test for scope is: are we talking about a part of sensory-based experience? Category is thinking of an event as an example of a group of things. This category can be subdivided into more specific categories, or it can be an example included in a more general category. The key test is: are we talking about an event as an example of a category? Asking, "What do you like about?" usually elicits further elaboration of someone's scope of experience, while asking, "What is important to you?" usually elicits how they categorize it. What do you like about usually elicits further elaboration of someone's scope of experience, while asking what is important to you about usually elicits how they categorize it. The words chunking down, and chunking up are ambiguous, since they have been used for years to describe either a change in scope or a change in category, without distinguishing between the two. Chunking down has been used for the process of either going to a smaller scope of experience or a more specific category. Chunking up has been used for a process of either going to a larger scope of experience or a more general category. Symbolic modeling with clean language provides an interesting example of a systematic therapeutic method that uses a specific questions to change the scope and categorization of a problem or outcome in order to reach resolution. Most of these questions elicit an elaboration of scope, while a few elicit a categorization. Learning how to track the scopes and categorize in your thinking makes it possible to change them in order to improve your experience when it is limited, problematic, or unpleasant. Learning how to track the scopes and categories in your thinking makes it possible to change them in order to improve your experience when it is limited, problematic, or unpleasant. If we describe thinking as the flow of our attention to different scopes, categorizing them and using prototypes to represent them, then thinking does not require language. If we describe thinking as the flow of our attention to different scopes, categorizing them and using prototypes to represent them, then thinking does not require language. Language communicates our thinking to others. When it works well, it elicits at least somewhat the same experience in the listener. There are several additional factors that often make it difficult to distinguish between scope and category. A change in scope often changes in the category, and categorization always affects scope. In next chapter we will explore how a change in scope often, but not always, elicits a change in category. Then in chapter 8 we will explore how category always affects scope. This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. George Bernard Shaw. Oh, what a wise man, this George Bernard Shaw. Page 140. Chapter 7. How scope influences category. Framing bundles. What would you like people to say about you at your funeral? Look, he's moving. In the joke above, the scope of your attention changes from thinking about what you would like others to remember about you in the past to what you would like them to notice about you in the present, indicating that you are still alive. An example of how a change in scope can change categorization. Once family therapist Jay Haley was actually asked a similar question in an interview. How would you like to be remembered? And Haley answered, I'd like to be remembered as the oldest living teacher of psychotherapy. Oldest living teacher. Perceptual scope can be changed by making it larger, smaller, overlapping, or different. This is what has sometimes been called a change in frame size in the NLP reframing patterns. Change in frame size. This perceptual scope can be changed by making it larger, smaller, overlapping, or different. This is what sometimes been called a change in frame size in the NLP reframing patterns. This can be done with either space or time or both. When the scope of an experience changes, the amount and kind of information that we attend to changes. This often results in a change in the criteria that we apply to it. Any change in information and/or criteria changes the way we categorize it and respond to it. The smallest way to change your response in a problem situation is to change the scope and find out if it results in a useful change in categorization and response. The simplest way to change your response in a problem situation is to change the scope and find out if it results in a useful change in categorization and response. You can attend to more of it, less of it, or to different parts of it, in either time or space. This is a pure process intervention, because when someone changes scope alone, any change in categorization arises entirely out of their own experience. For instance, this is pure process intervention. For instance, imagine that you are in a small space with nothing else nearby, and notice your feeling in response to this. If you expand the scope of what you see, you might notice familiar surroundings, family and friends. This larger scope will probably change your response because there is more content to respond to. In this example, both the amount of information and the kind of information changes as you increase the scope. When someone is narrowly focused on a nasty argument with their spouse, they may feel bad and decide that they need to divorce. When they expand their scope in space and time to include all the other more positive aspects of their relationship, they can gain what is often called the big picture, or a new perspective, and be capable of much more balanced and useful response. That is usually a much better starting point for examining a disagreement and begin problem solving to discover how to resolve differences. Again, imagine that you are in a small space with nothing else nearby. This time, as you expand the scope of what you see, continue to see the same kind of empty surroundings. Continue to see same kind of empty surroundings. This time, as you expand the scope of what you see, continue to see same kind of empty surroundings. As you make that scope of what you see larger, your feelings will probably change. You may begin to experience a feeling of isolation or loneliness, like being in the middle of the barren Sahara desert. When the kind of information doesn't change, but the amount of information changes, the change in quantity may result in reaching a threshold that shifts the quality of your response to it. The word enough always indicates when a criterion reaches a threshold of quantity: large enough, long enough, pleasant enough, etc. So even when a change in scope doesn't change the content of the criteria, a sufficient change in quantity alone can result in a change in categorization and response. For instance, when you eat a small amount of a favorite dessert, it probably tastes exquisite. If you eat a substantially more, it probably doesn't taste quite as good. And if you really stuff yourself with it, it would eventually begin to taste disgusting. People who are troubled by binge eating tend to resist their favorite foods by dieting and controlling what they eat, with the result that the favorite foods become even more attractive and tempting. Then they binge and eat so fast that they can't really taste and enjoy what they are eating, and then return to their diets. This extreme oscillation ruins the normal feedback that signals us to stop eating when we have had enough. Reframing patterns based on large scope. Reframing is a general term that has been used for a wide variety of different communication patterns, some of which change scope, while others change category directly. Reframing is a metaphorical term that literally means to put a different frame around an event so that someone will respond to it differently. A frame is a boundary that specifies the scope of an experience and at the same time that it provides a context for it. The width and character of a frame may introduce content that may change how we view what is inside it. Think of any image and then notice how different it looks when surrounded by an elaborate Baroque gold leaf frame compared to a narrow plain aluminum frame or a frame made of weathered barn wood. What differences do you notice in the image itself when it is surrounded by these different frames? The kind of frame categorizes what is inside the frame and may change the lighting or other qualities of the image in the frame. A Baroque gold frame categorizes the image as being from the distant past. At the surface of the image may take on the dark, aged character of an old oil painting. An aluminum frame indicates a more contemporary image, and the coloring and surface of the image may become clearer and brighter. Whether barn wood provides a more rustic context. When you experiment with frames, use the same kind of frame in order to avoid introducing this kind of content and categorization so that you can explore the effects of scope alone. When you experiment with frames, use the same kind of frame in order to avoid introducing this kind of content and categorization so that you can explore the effect of scope alone. Whether barn wood. When you experiment with frames, use the same kind of frame in order to avoid introducing this kind of content. In order to avoid introducing this kind of content and categorization so that you can explore the effect of scope alone. Using the distinctions of scope and category, we can be much more specific about exactly how different kinds of reframing work. Several of the NLP reframing or sleuth of mouth patterns Using the distinctions of scope and category, we can be much more specific about exactly how different kinds of reframing work. Several of the NLP reframing or sleuth of mouth patterns discussed below are based on a shift to a larger scope. The patterns that change category directly will be discussed in the following chapter. The patterns that change category directly. The patterns that change category directly will be discussed in the following chapter. Okay. Prior cause. Directing attention to causes that influenced a present event increases the scope of time into the past. Usually the scope of space will also change, providing additional information that may result in changing how you categorize and respond to an event. For instance, Stephen Covey writes, I remember a mini paradigm shift I experienced one Sunday morning on a subway in New York. People were still sitting quietly, some reading newspapers, some lost in thoughts, some resting with their eyes closed. It was a calm, peaceful scene. Then suddenly a man and his children entered the subway car. The children were so loud and rambunctious that instantly the whole climate changed. Rambunctious. Rambunctious. The man sat down next to me and closed his eyes, obviously to the situation. The children were yelling back and forth, throwing things, even grabbing people's papers. It was very disturbing, and yet the man sitting next to me did nothing. It was difficult not to feel irritated. I could not believe that he could be so insensitive as to let his children run wild like that and do nothing at all. It was easy to see that everyone else on the subway felt irritated too. So finally, with what I felt was unusual patience and restraint, I turned to him and said, Sir, your children are really disturbing a lot of people. I wonder if you couldn't control them a little more. The man lifted his gaze as if to come to a consciousness of the situation for the first time and said softly, Oh, you're right. I guess I should do something about it. We just came from the hospital where their mother died about an hour ago. I don't know what to think, and I guess they don't know how to handle it either. Suddenly, I saw things differently. I behaved differently. My irritation vanished. I didn't have to worry about controlling my attitude or my behavior. My heart was filled with the man's pain. Feelings of sympathy and compassion flowed freely. Everything changed in an instant. Reviewing a parent's childhood learning experience will often change how the children view their parents. This was a major part of Virginia Satir's family reconstruction process, in which a client could view a reenactment, depicting their parents' experiences of growing up. This